We know that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to my podcast that focuses on 3 areas I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and will be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory, and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. Grab a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. So AI is one of the most talked about shifts in the world of work right now, but much of the conversation focuses on automation, efficiency, or risk. And today we're taking a different angle. So we're exploring what AI means for career growth, for how roles are shaped, and for the kinds of conversations leaders and managers need to be having with their people. Because if AI creates space in our roles, the real question becomes, what do we do with it? I'm joined by Jon Matthews from the Career Innovation Company, who specialises in helping organisations think differently about careers, capability, and future skills. Jon, welcome.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks, Lisa.
So let's start here. When people hear AI at work, they often think automation or, like, worst case scenario, redundancy. You frame it quite differently, and I'm interested in hearing a bit more about how you think about AI for career growth. Tell me a bit about that.
I think the starting point has to be honesty around this in organizations. People don't need leaders to pretend this isn't a big shift. AI and automation are obviously definitely here. They are going to change work. And whilst we don't know what every detail of that will look like at the moment, we do know that standing still is not going to be an option. So for me, that kind of honesty is actually the kind of foundational piece that's needed for trust.
Mm.
People want to feel part of the conversation, not like change is being done to them. And once you're kind of clear about the reality, you can help people pivot much faster into some sort of constructive mindset, which is, how do I stay valuable? What strengths become more important that I bring? The growth opportunity going to be for me here? And that's where I think some of the shifts we're seeing with AI and automation can genuinely support it. It can take away parts of the work that actually are perhaps less interesting and create the space for a more human contribution in terms of bringing better judgment, more time for relationships and connectedness, more creativity, opportunity to do more learning potentially. So for people who are, and I'm very conscious that one of the things that's happening in organisations that there are some people that perhaps won't see it as risky at the moment, and there's a lot of early adopters out there as well who are doing really interesting stuff. I think the opportunity with them is to connect with them and move their experimenting on from personal productivity to, well, how does this improve work for the team, for the function, for the organisation overall? So.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity, but probably starts with being straight with people about the scale of the change and then helping them build some confidence and agency to start navigating that.
I absolutely love what you said about being part of the conversation, so that change is not done to them. It's such a simple shift in thinking about how things are done, rather than we're just announcing stuff, to actually involving people in the conversation, which doesn't mean, and I hear leaders sometimes say, well, that means we're handing over control to everyone else and they're going to make all the decisions. It doesn't have to mean that, but it's actually
No,
just about being inclusive and having the conversations and, as you say, taking people on that journey and reassuring them and another point you made about, you know, really highlighting the value that those people bring, and that the dial can be almost turned up on that a little bit when we've got AI being able to take some of the other stuff off their plates.
Absolutely, absolutely, and finding a way to be honest with each other about the ambiguity and fears, I think, through
Yeah.
conversation is absolutely what's needed at this stage.
There's a lot to be said, isn't there? That honesty about the fear and the ambiguity. So, yeah, great point. So, if AI is reducing parts of the workload, which sounds ideal, what should individuals and organizations be doing with that space that it creates?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So I think sometimes it's important not to overcomplicate this and make it seem too scary. So sometimes when AI is creating space in organizations, I think actually the win's really simple.
Mm,
I think particularly in a lot of knowledge work, the tasks that are most likely to be automated are the frustrating, repetitive parts that people might not especially enjoy doing, to be honest.
mm,
So it's definitely organizations were embracing that kind of automation quite quickly is a genuine win-win because the business can get efficiency, speed, and potentially stronger profitability. And the individual gets more time for the parts of the work that are more interesting, that are more intrinsically motivating, and probably more valuable to the organisation as well as the individual. So I think there's a kind of reality that in a narrative around fear, we kind of got to hold on to the there are some really simple, quick wins for all stakeholders.
mm,
But it doesn't mean that redesign doesn't of workflow doesn't sort of matter when it's a bit deeper as well, I suppose. So over time, organizations are going to need to think quite carefully about how the roles and workflows and expectations of people evolve. But early gains that we could get from simple automations could be a very practical bridge between the current way of working and the more
mm,
transformative kind of future state.
mm,
Um, um, I think in some cases that progress can even um, well, I think if you go back to the idea of simple automations and creating space in organizations where that time is really precious, it's entirely possible for some organizations to kind of fund the next wave of change by doing some of that automation, by creating capacity and making that, finding that win-win.
mm,
But I suppose it comes back to that trust piece we started talking about before as well. People need to believe that the space created will be used constructively for better work, for better contribution, a contribution that feels more valuable, more purposeful, for better learning, like I said before. And it's not space that's just going to lead to more pressure.
mm.
And there is a risk there. I think the neuroscientists would be very quick to point out that as we speed things up through using AI and automation, we risk burning out way earlier in the day because we've overstimulated ourselves and we can't cognitively keep up.
Yeah.
Um, um,
I couldn't
but
agree more. I couldn't agree more with that point because I think I see too many people, particularly the leaders and managers I work with, who are so busy, head down in doing mode, kind of, and spending too much time, as one team put it once, like just being in the weeds, like they're just not elevated enough to be strategic.
yeah,
And so, actually, the appeal of AI being able to automate some things is great, but unless, going to your point, people consciously think about how they design that space, my fear is that it would just get used to do more and more activity. And so people
yeah,
get busier and busier. And, it's almost like, well, we can now put more on your plate because we've taken that bit off. And I am a massive fan of rather than putting more on, it's about doing less to achieve more. So with that space, actually use that space as a space to sit back and reflect and think, okay, what are we doing well? What's not working? What should we be doing more of, less of, just leave altogether, and actually do the stuff that leaders should be doing but haven't had time to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think there's a something about finding meaning as well.
Mm,
Particularly, this will become particularly important as the work that we do that isn't that we still do that isn't done by agentic AI when we get there, which might be a little way off for a lot of jobs. The having the time to be able to find the meaning in the work
mm,
requires reflection, and fundamentally that's what
mm,
humans need. It's
mm.
an enduring truth.
Yeah.
Otherwise, our future looks pretty bleak.
Yeah, and I think it's again, it's such a simple point, which is what I talk a lot about. Actually, when we do business well and we look after people well, it's not about making things complicated. It's about being really simple. And you've talked about, valuing people and having a clear sense of purpose and meaning. And there's nothing better to motivate people than then knowing why they're doing what they're doing and the difference it will make and how they're part of, their contribution to their team and to the bigger organization. And people don't spend enough time on the why. So people just think that they focus on their little bit and that can feel monotonous or, what is the point? The why is everything, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And like we said, there's a real potential to have the time to do the why really well,
Yeah.
deeply.
So you talk about job crafting, which is, when we were sitting recently at another event
Mm.
talking about this, and I was like, actually, I really like the sound of this. So it's about not doing a role just because it's always been done that way, which again, I'm a real fan of because I think half of what goes on in businesses, people should probably just scrap and start again because it's just like we've always done it like this, so we just keep doing it. What does job crafting then look like in practice?
Yeah, so I think job crafting becomes more important than ever in the age of AI, because once technology starts taking over the repeatable tasks, we're almost in that point, getting to your point, I think, where we can stop pretending that roles are these fixed things that laid out on a job description. Um, the shape of work will start to move more quickly. So anyway, I think a simple way to think about job crafting is that people proactively reshape parts of their role. So that can mean changing the mix of tasks that they focus on. It could mean changing how they work with other people. It could mean changing how they understand the purpose of their role, getting back to that kind of meaning piece, I suppose. So it's partly about task design, it's partly about relationships, and it's partly about meaning. Um, I'd probably go a little bit broader than job crafting on its own,
Hmm.
because I think one of the big opportunities is uh, not just job crafting for an individual to think about it or doing it in a team, but is really getting the people that are closest. So the organizational for the organizational to get value, getting the people that are closest to the work really involved in redesigning it, I think will be incredibly valuable as we move to a more blended approach to getting things done using technology than we've had in the past. Because it's the people that understand the processes, the bottlenecks, the workarounds, the cross-functional dependencies, the stuff that is left implicit outside of what's written in operating models and job design. So I think job crafting is really interesting because and approaches like that that get people on the front line to rethink work really intelligently, giving them some scaffold to do that will be incredibly valuable. for the organization as well as the individuals that kind of need to feel like they've got jobs, roles that have meaning, purpose, etc. Um, so people will then have agency because they feel involved. If they do it really well, job crafting involves identifying the stuff that you want to be really good at and doing more of it. So it leans into that human need for competence, for mastery, and it lets them be part of shaping the change. Going back to the first question we were talking about, not just on the receiving end of a change that's coming through a system.
Mm.
Potentially, if an organization does it really well as well, there's a huge amount of rich data that could come from exercises like job crafting, role crafting from frontline employees, because it will surface what this is the work that really gets done, what skills are really going to be valuable, what skills need to be developed at an aggregated level in the organization. So it'll be really valuable relative to a sort of top-down
Mm.
organizational design exercise. Yeah, so yeah,
Yeah, I'm smiling as you talk through that because I mean, it's a massive shift, isn't it, from kind of just inheriting a role or a set of expectations about this is how we work to being able to step into a space where you actively shape it.
yeah,
And I think depending on the organization, some people will kind of just fully embrace that, and some people will need a lot more support to have the confidence to say what they think is really going on in terms of what gets in the way. You talked about having the people closest to that particular part of the business to be involved because they know what's working, what isn't. And it
yeah,
reminds me when I was working with a client who were going through their company were going through a big period of change. And so we were talking about that process and the conversations because we created the space for people to sit and talk about what was and what needs to be in the future. The stuff that came out because people had the space to say, well, actually, you know what? When we have this process over here and it has to go via that person, that person, that person before it comes to me, it's really slow, laborious. Actually, if we just steps that made a step in that process, we could speed that up masses. And the one of the senior people who's wandering around the table listening to the conversation was like, wow, I didn't realize that was a barrier, and I didn't realize that's such a straightforward thing to resolve. Again, it goes back to asking the people who are closest to that work for what is working, what isn't working, what should we be doing better. And
yeah,
that's the ideal stuff to be doing in that space, isn't it?
completely. And I think what's if AI and automation is a catalyst for people doing more of that type of work with individuals and teams, it also creates a kind of simple toolkit for people, managers, leaders to use for continuously adapting over time. You're kind of building that muscle for kind of finding a way to talk about the work such that you're kind of getting an adaptability muscle ready for the next wave of change, which we can't even imagine yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I wonder, you were talking about identifying the skills that are needed because this is going to flag a whole heap of stuff that people then need to develop that hasn't been recognized in the past because we're now looking at that. I wonder, and I'd be curious to know your thought on this, if there is some anxiety or resistance, reluctance to engage in that in terms of it's going to suddenly throw up all this stuff that we need to have conversations, and maybe our managers aren't very good at leading like genuine conversations. All these skills that we suddenly think didn't realize we needed these in our company, but now we do. Is that something you think could be an issue or not so much?
Yeah, well, I think it's a perennial issue. So this isn't new in organisations. The need for leaders and managers to be able to hold a space to have better conversations. I think that it just comes into focus so much more when the anticipated pace of change and the kind of existential need to change work so quickly comes comes to the fore, it becomes so much more
Mm.
important. I think there's a real risk in organisations in recent times to in um, place too much of the burden of adapting to change and finding a way to drive a career on the individual. I think people do need to be proactive, and we spend a huge amount of our time, giving people career skills in their thousands at a time. But you can't expect employees to work out their future for their role, where their value comes from, what their development path is entirely on their own. It's not reasonable or fair. So managers and organizations become really important in terms of creating the support and structures that help people interpret the change, I think. Um,
And that requires leaders and managers to understand the process of change, which I think a lot of them don't. They understand the kind of process part, like we're here now, we need to get to there. But
yeah,
in terms of leading people through it and overcoming resistance and so on, that's a whole different skill set, isn't it?
yeah. You articulate what is shifting, what still matters, where the growth opportunity might be, what support is available. Um, Career conversations are really probably the most practical way of doing that, because they start to make the invisible visible, if you do them really well. Um, it does take a lot of honesty, though, I think, in this kind of context we're in, where people can't, the horizon on which people can predict what's going to happen is relatively near. Um, so it requires a bit of honesty, but it's still important to surface, mutual expectations, where people's confidence gaps are, where people feel like they need development, understanding. Um, what are the big questions that people are consistently asking in an organization, or different segments of the workforce are asking? People will want to know where they fit in the future.
With all that work, I mean, it's essentially you're describing kind of shift in how work happens, which is going to require different skills in our leaders and managers. And you've already talked about having good conversations and we touched on sort of leading through change and supporting people with kind of thinking about their career development. What other skills do you think that leaders and managers need to be really mindful of developing so that they can support the workforce as this world of work changes?
It's important to avoid managers and leaders falling into generational stereotypes around what people might need, um, but also have them recognize that the stage of career that someone is at might be really important. Um, so typically in the work that we do, we're typically trying to support people to think about, well, what would someone in their early career need? Often it's around kind of clarity and confidence for them. Mid-career, people might have quite different needs from a conversation. Things like, how do you help them with the capacity they've got, the trade-offs they're having to make, just feeling stuck, something that, we come across a lot.
Mm.
Um, uh, Someone who's more experienced might be thinking more about how do they, you know, maximize their impact, continue to stay relevant, maybe build their sort of legacy. So, helping people have conversations that fit with those scenarios, and the typical scenarios that happen in a particular context of a particular organization that does particular sort of work. There will always be certain scenarios that come up time and time again. And Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's just going to bring it into focus if
Mm,
work's changing faster than ever.
mm,
All of those things get amplified. All of those needs get amplified massively.
mm.
So suddenly that capability to have those conversations, keep people motivated and feeling a sense of growth and a sense of direction, isn't a soft extra anymore. It's the sort of
Yeah.
fundamentals of how you're going to create an agile workforce.
I think I really like what you just said there, John, about the difference between generational differences and career stage, because there can often be a lot of emphasis put on Gen X and so on, and Gen Z, and actually it's I like what you just highlighted about identifying someone's early into their career or kind of midway through or nearing the end and needing different things. And I know when I've been working with graduates recently, we've been talking about sort of coaching style
Mm.
conversations. And as people get further through their career, they that might feel less important to them, but it's knowing what's important for people at different stages. And so you've hit the nail on the head there. But again, that's highlighting a whole load of different skills that managers need to have in terms of how to have a good coaching conversation. That's not about just telling people what to do and sort of it's stepping back from being in control mode, isn't it? And actually about empowering other people, which again is a big shift for some people to make.
Yeah, and it requires something very different from day to day um, performance towards um, near-term objectives and
Mm,
OKRs and the things that managers are potentially more explicitly rewarded and recognized for.
mm. And you also just now were emphasizing, you repeated the word kind of the particular context. It's like about the particular organization. And again, that's something I talk a lot about. You can't have off the shelf approaches or stuff that works really well because every organization is different and the people's needs are different, their context is different. So how would you encourage organizations then to think about I don't know how to have these kinds of career conversations in terms of I might be an organization who is, I don't know, to do with manufacturing, and there's another organization over here who actually could still be manufacturing, but a very different context, or they might be in marketing or, finance. Are there similar threads or similar approaches, or is it about being very, very different in every organization?
So I think one of the things to way to frame well, a good way to frame this is that careers have always been co-created.
Mm,
And I think that's a useful frame for this. The individual has to bring agency and curiosity and willingness to adapt and do new things. So the organization kind of creates the environment in which that adaptation is either possible or it's very difficult. And I think the organizational responsibility at this point in time becomes more important, but also more difficult at the moment. Uh, I think a few years, if we're honest, a few years ago, it would have been much easier for an organization to kind of define a fairly stable view of how careers were going to work. And now, because things are starting to shift that much quicker, it's a pretty confusing and world out there. There's much less certainty.
mm,
So I don't think organizations need to pretend that they've got a perfect map. But what I do think they need to be clear about is what they do know and what they can be honest about, and try and find the principles for how careers and growth should work in that organization that fit their reality and where there are gaps in their ability to predict the future. But if they can at least land on some set of principles that guide careers and growth, then they are doing something that gives some context to people that is relevant to the specific organization, their specific business model, the way that they work. the way that they make money ultimately, and what that means for strategic workforce planning. Um, I think if an organization can do that, then it makes much more sense for why you give people agency, because you're also able to articulate how they can use that agency. I guess so. Yeah, we talk to organizations about trying to create a career philosophy. Those kind of big, broad guiding principles. It's not a fixed promise about how every career is going to work, but it's a strong enough vision for how they should work that allows that to be articulated in some sort of narrative to people. It makes it easier for managers to have those conversations we were saying that can be, difficult.
Mm.
And it's often the thing that hasn't been articulated because of the tendency in the last 20 years to kind of focus on talent pools and how you're creating particular tracks and paths for specific high potential streams of employees.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think that is the thing that we would advocate the organization needs to take responsibility for, and the thing that gets to your point about that contextual reality that fits the specific organization and what they're strategically trying to achieve.
And it's so powerful, isn't it? I love what you just said about the kind of guiding principles, because if you have guiding principles, then it doesn't matter to some extent what happens, because the future is uncertain, it's
Mm.
unpredictable. So as long as we know, as long as we have behaviors that enable us to have the right kinds of conversations and to be open-minded and to know how to embrace uncertainty and so on, it puts us in a position where we can lean into the unknown. Whereas if it's too fixed and it's almost like a set of rules that's very kind of sequential, as soon as something doesn't go according to plan, which let's face it is a lot of the time,
Yeah,
throws people. So having it goes back to this kind of the essential principles and behaviors that mean that people can be resilient in the future and not be afraid of the unknown.
yeah, absolutely. I think um, there's a responsibility from organizations to make the agency that people can experience um, possible in the context of being clear about where they have clarity, honest about where they haven't got any clarity about what's happening, and just giving people some support to try and move forward with confidence one way or another. That's kind of the essence of, I suppose, the enduring truth of what's true about principles in most organizations, but they'll be very specific to the organization.
So if someone listening wanted to take some first steps towards having better career conversations, job crafting, kind of what we've been talking about today, what would you advise they go and think about and start doing?
Um, so I think it's it's fundamental to start with what's the organization need from the workforce going going forward. So that's almost a kind of strategic workforce planning lens. Then translate that ideally into those career principles at an organizational level. That usually requires the business leadership and frankly HR verticals collaborate on that, so that there is enough alignment to have something that stands up over time, and then highlights the conflicts and tension in those principles that are agreed, so that the challenges behind that can be addressed. Usually, there usually has to be in an organization some sort of communication mechanism for how do you get this out to managers, get this out to people so that they understand what career frameworks, pathways, etc. Exist. Um, then the other three elements are more around supporting people. If you've got that kind of big directional strategic stuff, the actual culture around careers will then get driven by how you support people. So lots of the larger organizations have been investing in talent marketplace technology so that people can actually see opportunity, which is fundamental because you have to have some sort of visibility of opportunity. Managers need to be supported to have career conversations. It is, as I say, a perennial challenge, and it would be daft not to invest in giving people toolkits and continuous support to be better at doing that for all the reasons we've talked about. And then finally, employees cannot be assumed to know what driving their own career actually means behaviorally. They deserve to be empowered, but with some skill building at the same time. So really important to give people a way of thinking and talking about how they are going to be intentional about what they do with their careers. They're the kind of the six elements I think I've probably outlined there that come together to do this really well. And often organizations have got some of those things in place. It's whether or not all of them are in place that's the challenge, and making sure that that the gaps are filled.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting actually you've finished on that bit about skills because it's you and I met most recently at the local skills improvement plans
Yeah,
meeting where we were talking about the skills that people in the workplace need. And, you've outlined six areas, but each one of those are quite sort of chunky areas to explore. And as you say, some organizations are doing it really, really well. And there are just bits that they're missing, which is obviously where the likes of you and I come in. So
absolutely. Yeah.
um, so if there's one mindset shift that you'd like leaders to take away when thinking about AI, careers, and how roles are designed, what would it be?
Um, think the big the big reflection on this would be, if you want people to, going back to where we started, to embrace AI and automation and the fundamental shift that means in what work gets done, it's really important to not talk to them about technology, but to talk to them about their future. Make it personal, I think, because careers are the frame through which people will ultimately make sense of change. They'll give their career story. That'll be the narrative of their working lives. Careers will, and the sense that people feel like they're building a careers will decide whether people lean in or hold back, experiment or resist change. And the extent to which they feel confident to build a new identity or to protect an old one. I think that's why it's so important. I think.
Mm,
So yeah, I think there's real power at this moment to use that career lens well, and I think organizations that are willing to go there, have that conversation with people about their future, are going to activate people at scale, and in ways that could be really practical and motivating at a personal level. And if you can do that across an organization, the impact could be absolutely huge at this juncture, because you've got a much better chance of getting all the benefit from the tech change and potentially adapting to the next wave of change all the quicker as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you, John. I can say as we wrap up, my kind of standout from this conversation is that AI isn't just about a sort of technology shift, which I think a lot of people focus on the technology side of that development. It's more of a thinking shift. It's kind of about creating that sense of space and being very intentional about what we do with that space, which I think is quite a nice way of framing that technology advance as well. I have really enjoyed talking to you. I knew I would when we got chatting about this last week. Thank you so much, John, for everything you brought to this conversation. We're going to put your website link in the show notes, and people can reach out to you directly to get more support with how
Right.
to do this really well in their organizations. So I really appreciate everything you've brought to the conversation today, for sharing your expertise. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me on.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen, and please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates for your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. Be sure to check out itstimeforchange.co.uk, where you'll find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join the Leadership Lens to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my next episode coming soon. Join me then.